Is that the dog people? Called Grandma Bone. Charlie's heart sank. Don't worry, Charlie. We won't let anything happen to him at all, said his mother. Grandma Bone was suddenly in the hall. She opened the front door and gave a yelp of surprise. Charlie ran into the hall, and a small, furry-looking man stood on the doorstep. Charlie recognized him immediately. It was his friend, Mr. Animus. Behind him stood 3 fierce-looking cats, the cause of Grandma Bone's yelp. She hated cats, particularly orange cats. These were orange, yellow, and copper-colored. Are you the dog exterminator? She asked suspiciously. I've seen you before, and these peculiar cats. She took a step backwards. The man held up a card. Orville Animus, madam. Pest control. Well, you'd better come in and get the dog, said Grandma Bone. Charlie, it's got a lead. Fetch it. Charlie leapt back into the kitchen, followed by Mr. Animus and the cats. It's okay, Charlie whispered to Maisie and his mother. Mr. Animus has come. Maisie pulled the lead out of her apron pocket and handed it over. You be good to that dog, she insisted. Mr. Animus winked. There was some good-natured growling and sniffing between cats and dog as Mr. Animus clipped the lead to Runner Bean's collar, but the big dog seemed very happy to see them all again. How did you know about Runner? Charlie whispered. The cats, said Mr. Animus. They wanted to pay you a visit. I didn't know nothing till I got here. Come and see us at the cafe, Charlie. Grandma Bone called, come on, get that dog out of here. Mr. Animus led the cheerful dog away, and Runner Bean looked back just once to give Charlie an encouraging bark. Cheerio, folks, said Animus. Grandma Bone slammed the door. Luckily, it was Charlie who answered the bell when the real pest control turned up. It's okay, Charlie told the man. We found the dog a home. With one problem solved, Charlie had a good night's sleep. In fact, he overslept. The next thing he knew, Maisie was shaking him away. I'm off now, Charlie. The taxi's waiting. Your mom's already gone to work, and Grandma Bone's off somewhere else. She put a scrap of paper on Charlie's pillow. It's the U-Beam's address, in case you need them. After all, they're your aunties. I hate leaving you on your own, but I've got no choice. I'll be okay, yawned Charlie. He couldn't imagine why he would need to call in the U-Beams. Maisie gave him a peck on the head, and then she was gone. It seemed unnaturally quiet. Charlie couldn't remember ever being completely alone in the house before. Uncle Peyton had always been there. Always. What had become of him? After breakfast, Charlie called in at the greengrocer's to see his mother, and she was weighing apples for an impatient-looking man, and there was a long queue behind him. I can't stop now, Charlie, she muttered. See you at tea time. I'll be all right, won't you? You'll be all right, won't you? Sure. I'm going over to Emma's, Charlie said cheerfully. Emma lived with her aunt, Julia Ingledoo, in a bookshop behind the cathedral. But as Charlie began to make his way up the steep road to the Ingledoos, he realized he was pulling out Maisie's scrap of paper out of his pocket. His aunts had a very strange address. Number 13, Darkly Wynd. Darkly Wynd, murmured Charlie. Is that a road? To an alley or another town entirely? Charlie went into the newsagent's. He bought a tube of peppermints and showed his scrap of paper to the woman behind the counter. Darkly Wynd? You're not going there, are you? I thought I might, said Charlie. Not a good idea. It's a nasty place, not suitable for young kids like yourself. Charlie was intrigued. Why? Very dark, no street lights, but it's daytime. Charlie pointed out. Things have happened in that place, love. Better not go. I've got relations there, said Charlie. The woman leaned over the counter, staring at Charlie. What sort of relations? She asked. Aunts. Great aunts. I'm sure I'll be all right. Please tell me where it is. The woman sighed and said, All right, but don't say I didn't warn you. Turn right at the top of this road, then go on till you see the gray bent crescent. It's off there somewhere. Thanks. Charlie left the shop before the woman could utter any more gloomy warnings. Gray bent crescent was what it sounded like. A crescent of tall gray buildings facing a semicircle of dusty grass. A huge fir tree stood in the center, lending an air of shadowy menace to the place. Exactly halfway around the crescent, there was a gap in the terraced houses, and a faded sign nailed to a side wall said Darkly Wynd. Charlie turned into a narrow, murky alley. On either side, grimy, windowless walls towered up to the sky. A damp wind swirled into his face, and it was hard to believe that only a moment ago he'd been standing in sunlight. The alley broadened into a courtyard surrounded by gaunt, ancient-looking houses. Like giant walls, they seemed to lean inwards, blotting out the light. Above them hung the darkest cloud Charlie had ever seen. He shivered. I began to walk past the houses, counting the numbers on the doors. Nearly every house appeared to be deserted. Windows had been boarded up, peeling doors nailed shut. Someone or something had driven all the former residents away. At number 5, a group of youths burst out of the door, fighting and screaming. Charlie hurried on. At number 9, a rough-looking man emerged from the basement. He bellowed at Charlie, who began to run. At number 11, a dustbin lid crashed to the pavement and a rat ran between Charlie's legs. Darkly Wynd didn't lead anywhere. At the end of the courtyard, a block of buildings taller than the others stood facing Charlie. They had strange turrets and iron-framed balconies, tall arched windows with pediments of gnomish faces and unlikely beasts. The first house was number 13. Charlie mounted the stone steps. On the black door, at the top, a brass knocker, shaped like a hand, hung above the number 13. Charlie didn't knock. Of course he didn't. Instead, he leaned over the railings and peered into a long window. The room beyond was filled with dark, looming furniture. He looked through the window on the other side of the porch and saw portraits of grim and serious people hanging 3 deep on every wall. The house was silent. It appeared to be empty. As Charlie retraced his steps, he noticed that the next house was also numbered 13. And so was the next. Oh, postman, muttered Charlie. The second house was also silent and gloomy, but the third came a whirring, ticking sound. To get a better view, Charlie ran down to the basement steps and climbed onto a narrow ledge beneath the long window. Standing on tiptoes, he could just see into the room beyond. What he saw there was more interesting than he could have ever hoped for. table almost filled the room. It was covered with scraps of cloth, sparkling sequins, feathers, buttons, tiny squares of mirror, velvet, leather, reels of cotton. A row of lights in bell-like brass shades hung over the table, illuminating 3 figures. Belle sat at a sewing machine, while Aunt Venetia and Dorcas stood side by side watching her. Aunt Venetia was holding a long hat pin with a black beetle on the tip. Belle said something and Venetia stuck the hat pin into a piece of red velvet. The velvet immediately became a writhing mass of shiny black beetles. Dorcas gasped, and so did Charlie. Belle looked at the window, and her violent blue stare sent Charlie toppling back onto a row of dustbins. Looking down at him from the front door was Asa Pike. What on earth are you doing here? Asked Charlie, picking himself up. I could ask you the same thing. Asa, who usually went about wearing a tatty disguise, looked extremely smart. He wore a leather jacket, white shirt, blue check tie, and stone-colored trousers. As if this wasn't surprising enough, he was carrying a bunch of tulips. My aunts live here, said Charlie. So why are you spying instead of going in? Asked Asa. Mind your own business. Asa shrugged and rang the doorbell, while Charlie leapt up the basement steps. When he reached the pavement, a sound from above made him glance up. A man looked out from a high-barred window. He had dark hair and a sullen face. Charlie felt sure he knew him. He got the impression that the man was a prisoner. Charlie ran on down Darkly Wynd, trying to get the horrible picture of crawling beetles out of his mind. Have you been to a horror movie? Said Emma, as Charlie leapt into Ingledoo's. You look awful. I've been somewhere horrible, all right, said Charlie. He told Emma about the beetles and Darkly Wynd. Emma's eyes widened, and then she said, to tell the truth, it doesn't surprise me. Your great aunts are so gruesome. My auntie's making sandwiches. Do you want some? Charlie certainly did. Julia Ingledoo made some delicious sandwiches with very exotic fillings. Today was no exception. Unfortunately, Saturday was Ingledoo's busiest day, so all they had to eat was sitting behind the counter, and Miss Ingledoo kept jumping up to help the customers. A man with an expensive taste in books and suits came by, and by the look of it had left the shop with a rare book on the fish. Miss Ingledoo didn't look as happy as she should have, considering the huge sum of money she'd been given. She nibbled a sandwich, cleared her throat, and said, Charlie, what's happened to your uncle? I don't know. He's gone off somewhere. Miss Ingledoo looked anxious. It's just that he usually comes to the shop at least twice a week, and there's been no word. Charlie was pleased to see that she reddened slightly. It meant that his uncle's crush on Miss Ingledoo wasn't entirely helpless. He left saying the ants were plotting, Charlie explained, and he had to stop someone dangerous from arriving. Wow, exclaimed Emma. I wonder if he succeeded. Me too, said Charlie. I do hope he's all right, said Miss Ingledoo anxiously. I don't know what I'd do without... he's so dependable, isn't he, Charlie? Certainly is, agreed Charlie. Charlie got home in time for tea, but wished he hadn't. Grandma Bone decided to put in an appearance, which meant that he had to eat a disgusting vegetable pie instead of his usual chips. There had been no word from Uncle Peyton, but Grandma Bone didn't seem to be worried at all. "I'm sure he's having a lovely holiday," she said. This convinced Charlie that the opposite was true. He also had a sneaking suspicion that his grandmother now knew where Peyton had gone. Her smug expression could only mean one thing. His uncle is in danger. After a painful half hour, Grandma Bone left Charlie and his mother to do the washing up. Charlie gave a huge sigh of relief. "Mom, I'm worried about Uncle Peyton. How can we find out where he's gone?" "We can't, Charlie. Your uncle knows what he's doing." She glanced at herself in the mirror and brushed her shoulders. "You haven't got another boyfriend, have you?" Charlie asked. His mother's answer wasn't very reassuring. "What makes you think that?" "Please don't forget, Dad," said Charlie. She smiled pensively. "Of course I won't, Charlie." On Sunday afternoon, Charlie went to the Pets Cafe, as usual. It was a good place for friends to meet as long as they didn't forget to bring a pet. Today, the bouncer, Norton Cross, let Charlie in without a pet. "Mr. Animus told me all about Runner Bean," said the big man. "Your pet's waiting for you, Charlie." He pointed at a table where Gabriel sat feeding biscuits to Runner Bean. The yellow dog gave a happy bark when he saw Charlie and jumped up, almost knocking Charlie over. After making a big fuss of Runner, Charlie sat beside Gabriel, whose lap was covered in gerbils. "I'm surprised Runner didn't eat those," Charlie remarked. "I don't think he eats things that move," said Gabriel. The Pets Cafe door clanged open and 3 more customers came in. Olivia and a white rabbit, Emma carrying a strange-looking bird in a cage, and a surprising visitor, Mr. Moldova. He held up his black rat Rembrandt, and Norton Cross waved him into the cafe. While the girls came over to Charlie's table, Mr. Moldova went over to the counter. "Mr. B came to the bookshop yesterday," Emma explained. "He wants to talk about Ollie and the boa thing, Charlie, so I brought him here." Mr. Moldova arrived at the table with a tray of cakes and orange juice. "My treat," he said. "Pass them around?" The art teacher took a seat between the girls while the cakes were divided fairly as possible. "Emma says you want to talk to me, sir," said Charlie, biting into a giant flapjack. Mr. Moldova lost his cheerful expression. "Yes, Charlie. I'll come straight to the point. There's a new girl in art, Belle Dollar. Apparently she's staying with your aunts. Does that mean she's related to you, Charlie?" Charlie choked on a crumb. "I hope not," he croaked. "Hey, what's going on?" asked Olivia. "Is there something we ought to know?" "Yes. What do you know about Belle?" said Mr. Moldova. "Nothing," said Charlie, "except her eyes keep changing color and I saw—" "What?" said Olivia impatiently. Charlie told them about Darkly Wynd and the beetles. It was one of my aunts who did the beetle thing, but I'm sure Belle had something to do with it. She's got some sort of power over them. "It must be her." "Her who?" said Olivia. Mr. Moldova gave a grim smile. "Emma has probably told you by now that my younger brother Ollie was a pupil at Bloor's. Just over a year ago, he disappeared. When I came to Bloor's to try and discover what had happened to him, I had to take on a new identity." There are people in Blores who would certainly want to get rid of me if they knew who I was. Get rid of? Said Emma. I'm afraid so. Mr. Moldova took a thoughtful bite of his fruitcake. One way or another. About Belle, Charlie prompted. Ah, Belle. Mr. Moldova wiped his mouth on a brown Pet's Cafe napkin and said, Beyond the mountains in the northeast, there's a castle. It was built in the 12th century, and once it had another name. Now it's known as Yubin Castle. He looked at Charlie. Charlie muttered, Yubin? But he didn't interrupt. Mr. Moldova continued. For centuries, the descendants of the Red King have lived in Yubin Castle. Most of the owners have been endowed. In the year 1900, a baby was born in the castle. She was named Yolanda. Her father was a shapeshifter, her mother a hypnotist. On her 21st birthday, Yolanda inherited the castle, although Mr. Moldova glanced at the children's expectant faces. Although it cannot be said that her father was thoroughly dead. Thoroughly dead? Squeaked Olivia. What does that mean? It means that one can never be sure when a shapeshifter has ceased to exist. Yolanda is now over 100 years old, and she can still take the shape of a 12-year-old girl. You mean, breathed Charlie, that Yolanda is Belle? I'm fairly certain, said Mr. Moldova. And I'm afraid that she's recognized me. My home isn't far from hers, and she has always resented the people in Sparkling Castle. There used to be so much fun, so much sparkle. But since Ollie went, we don't enjoy making things glitter anymore, my father and I. Yes, we both have the talent. Sadly, Ollie doesn't. His gift is musical. He was also blessed with boundless curiosity, and I was always afraid this would lead him into trouble. There's a portrait of Selena Sparks, sir. Was she a sparkler? Charlie asked. Selena? Ah, yes, a wonderful lady by all accounts, were descended from her brother, who didn't have the gift. Selena never married, having too much fun, no doubt. Charlie longed to ask how the sparkling happened, but he thought that the time wasn't quite right. Olivia had no such qualms. What do you do, sir? She asked. How do you make things sparkle? Never mind about that, said the teacher. And then, seeing the disappointed faces, he said, Oh, well, and reached into his pocket. He brought out a fistful of small stones, and holding them over the table, he let the stones roll gently in his open palm. 4 hands bent closer, and suddenly the stones began to sparkle. The children could feel the heat from the dazzling radiance the stones threw out. And Runner Bean and the rabbit and the parrot and the gerbils all began squeaking and barking in unison. The rat Rembrandt, being used to seeing spectacles, watched in silence. Mr. Moldova closed his fist, and the sparkles died. Emma's bird immediately cried, I'll be darned! They can be dangerous, said Mr. Moldova, slipping the stones into his pocket. How can you hold them, sir, when they're so hot? Asked Gabriel. To tell the truth, I've no idea, said the teacher. Mr. Animus appeared beside the table, wanting to know what had been going on. Who's upsetting my customers? He said, meaning the animals. Mr. Moldova was about to confess when Mr. Animus suddenly put a finger to his lips. Nope. Don't tell me. You're one of them, aren't you, sir? He winked at Charlie and went on. What do you think of old Runner Bean? Looks happy enough, doesn't he? He looks great, Mr. Animus. How's he getting along with the cats? Ah, no problem, Charlie. They're pals. Speaking of the Flames, they've been showing a lot of interest in that school of yours just lately. Is everything okay there? For a moment, Charlie hesitated, then looking up at Mr. Moldova, he said softly, No, it isn't. He lowered his voice and told Mr. Animus about Belle and the invisible Ollie. Strike me, murmured Mr. Animus. No wonder the cats are curious. At the moment, a group of very noisy customers arrived. 4 black dogs with square muzzles and dangerous eyes. The 2 youths who accompanied them were mild enough, but Charlie sensed something awkward about them. They were both overweight with sandy hair and pink freckled faces. You could tell they hadn't spent much time training their dogs. Rottweilers, muttered Gabriel. You better watch Runner. They're nasty fighters. Mr. Animus hopped away to attend to the barking that had broken out, while Runner Bean began his low grumbles. He would have liked to get closer to the Rottweiler gang, but didn't dare chance it. The children finished their tea, and after several hugs, Charlie led Runner Bean to the safety behind the counter. See you next week, he said to the yellow dog. As he walked towards the door, the Rottweilers moved into his path. Their growls had a menacing edge, and for a moment Charlie didn't dare pass them. Sorry, mate. One of the youths gave a reluctant grin and pulled the Rottweiler out of his way. Gabriel had already opened the door, and Charlie sprinted through it, almost knocking the girl standing outside. Dorcas Lynn. Hi, said Charlie. What are you doing here? Oh, I'm waiting for my brothers, said Dorcas. Haven't you got an animal? Asked Gabriel. Don't like 'em, said Dorcas. At the moment, Mr. Moldova came through the door, followed by Emma and Olivia. Oh, Dorcas's eyes grew very round. Fancy seeing you here, sir. The art teacher gave a slight smile. Hello, Dorcas. And then Dorcas caught sight of Emma's bird. How cute, she said. What is that? Minna. I wouldn't. She was too late to stop Dorcas poking her finger into the cage. Coochie coochie, said Dorcas. The Minna pecked her finger, and Dorcas gave a loud, ear-splitting shriek. One of the Rottweilers' youths stuck his head out of the door and said, What's the matter, Dorsey? What happened? Beastly, rotten, vile, smelly bird bit me. You shouldn't keep violent, vicious pets, said the youth, glaring at Emma. Mr. Moldova said, Don't be stupid. I'd say 4 Rottweilers posed more of a threat than a mere Minna. The youth raised his fist, thought better of it, and then withdrew behind the door, saying, We'll be out in a sec, Dork. Dorcas had by now calmed down a little, but when Emma apologized for her Minna's behavior, Dorcas wouldn't even look at her. Bye, Dorcas, the others called as they walked away. Dorcas turned her back and sucked her finger. When they reached High Street, Mr. Moldova said, Now look, I don't want any of you to try and rescue Ollie again. But, Charlie began. No. It's too dangerous, Mr. Moldova said forcefully. Believe me, I'm grateful for your help, Charlie and Emma. But it's up to me now, okay? The children grudgingly agreed, and the art teacher walked off in the direction of Bloor's Academy. Emma and Olivia took a street that led to Ingledoo's bookshop, and Gabriel and Charlie headed up to the crossroads. Before they parted, Charlie said, "Do you think Dorcas was spying on us? She's changed a lot lately. Ever since I saw her at the house in Darkly Wynd, I've had this feeling that she's not what we all thought she was." "She's certainly lost weight," said Gabriel. "It's not just that," Charlie said with a grin. "Well, she's endowed, but we don't know how yet. As for the spying, I thought Billy Raven was the spy. We all know he's in league with Manfred and that horrible Mr. Old Ezekiel. There's always room for another spy," Charlie kept saying thoughtfully. "And Billy might not be any use to them now, for all we know. Besides, I feel kind of sorry for Billy, being an orphan and having to live in that dark old building all the time. Never going home, ever? Imagine!" "Can't," Gabriel admitted with a shiver. "See you tomorrow, Charlie." Gabriel lopped away with the gerbil clinging to a clump of his floppy hair. It looked so funny Charlie couldn't help but smile, but then his thoughts turned to Belle, and his face got sad.